Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland, and here I am in London on Craven Street, and behind me is where the German poet Heinrich Heine stayed on his visit to London in 1827, when he stayed for a few months. Of course, international travel was so slow then. The train was only invented in 1825. There was just that Stockton-Darlington railway at first, so it came from Germany by stagecoach, as in pulled by a horse, and then obviously by ship and around the United Kingdom by stagecoach. Well, that was the fastest way to travel at the time. So Heine was born in 1799 in Germany into a Jewish family, and they'd lived in the western section of Germany for centuries. There was a significant Jewish population in the Rhine Valley. So apart from his Judaic faith, he was in every sense a German. Obviously German was his mother tongue, and his family was not particularly observant. So it was a time of great ferment in Germany and for European Jewry generally, because he was born 10 years after the French Revolution. And France abolished the legal disabilities on its Jewish minority at that time. And later on, obviously, Napoleon rose to be first consul and crowned himself emperor in Notre Dame. Although he was negrophobic, Napoleon was actually philo-Semitic. And he conquered much of Germany. He had Prussia, for example, as an ally for a while. Others were just really satrapies of France, and those states in the French orbit usually had Napoleon's relatives and in-laws on the throne there, insisted on marrying his siblings off to various princes and princesses. But anyway, Napoleon made sure that discriminatory laws against Jewish people were abolished in many of these German states. So he was hailed by German Jews, and some of them even adopted the surname Schönteil, as in Buonaparte. That's what it would mean if you translate it. It was only when he was in his 30s that Napoleon Gallicized his surname to Bonaparte. Anyway, so Heine grew up in an affluent family. He attended a number of universities. It was quite common in the 18th and 19th century in Germany to switch from one university to another after a year or so and keep switching. Anyway, so he got himself in trouble over his radical opinions. He was a teenager at the time the Napoleonic Wars came to an end, and so this is getting on towards the Vormärz era in German history, the pre-March, as in the run-up to the 1848 revolution, when it was a very long run-up, where radical nostra in the air, but this is really just for some cafe intellectuals. So some liberals saying there should be greater freedom of expression, there should be the right to vote, certainly for the propertied classes, some sort of legislature, because in many German states there were absolute monarchs. So the Holy Roman Empire had been dissolved in 1806, just after the Battle of Austerlitz. The Peace of Pressburg, we now call it Bratislava. There at the Bishop's Winter Palace, Napoleon had prevailed upon the Holy Roman Emperor, who was one of the Habsburgs, to dissolve the empire. That was, I think France was the emperor at the time. I was in Francis. So Germany is divided into 360 states, some of which were tiny, which were a lot more like a larger state, others which were enormous, like Prussia, the size of a middling European country. So they all had their standard German, and literacy was spreading, partly thanks to, well, obviously Luther's Bible, and to the Brothers Grimm, their collection of fairy tales, things like that. But there were obviously many local dialects, at least 24 dialects, which were quite distinct. But Germany was one of the most literate countries in the world. Prussia, the largest portion of it, had introduced compulsory schooling in the 18th century. So Heine was a very learned chap, obviously had to learn the classics, Latin and ancient Greek, achieved absolute mastery of French, and learned a tiny bit of English, because some people involved in trade started to learn English at that time, particularly in the northern German port cities. So he came over here and spent some time, but he did not find London to his taste. It was too damp, it was too misty, it was already polluted with so much coal smoke. The population of London being almost 2 million at the time, being one of the largest cities in the world. And he didn't like George Canning. He was here during Canning's very brief premiership, which lasted under 4 months. Canning, an Irish leader, hurrah! But he was born here, a Tory Prime Minister who took over after Lord Liverpool's demise, but Canning died in office after only 4 months, died at Chiswick House, the very same room where Charles James Fox had expired 21 years earlier. So that was Heine. So he left here, he went to Paris, which he found much more congenial, eventually being sort of a grand old man of German letters, and a really indefatigable voice for liberalism, very excited by the 1840 revolution, very disillusioned that they didn't manage to get it together, managed to fall out amongst themselves. It wasn't in favour of socialism. That came along when he was just a bit too old to adapt to, and I don't think he ever returned to Germany after 1827. What else about him? Well, he presciently said, "Where first you burn books, later you burn people," and then when the National Socialists took office in 1933, they proved this with their bookless library, taking all these books out of the Humboldt University in Berlin and burning them in huge bonfires only weeks after they came to office, including the works of Heine. Incidentally, Heine had converted to Christianity in early adulthood. He felt it was the price he had to pay for his entree into high society, as he didn't attach much importance to his family's Jewish religion. It didn't make much of a difference to him. He became a Lutheran. That's the main type of Protestant in Germany, as in set up by Martin Luther. But again, he was not a very spiritual, not passionate about the Christian faith either. So he was one of the most celebrated German poets in the late 19th century, read a lot into the early 20th century, obviously banned by the National Socialists in 1933, came back into fashion a bit after the Second World War. I'm not good enough at German to fully appreciate his poesy. Well, that's a little bit about Heinrich Heine. So please follow me on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook. Book lessons with me in English language, and English as a foreign language, English literature, history, geography, religious studies, politics, law, what else? And hire me as your tour guide here in London. Thank you so much for your donations on Patreon and PayPal. Right, toodle pip.